The neighborhood had forgotten what green looked like. Lawns had long since turned to dust, and the few trees that once shaded the cracked sidewalks were stumps now, their roots pried up to make way for parked cars that rarely ran. The nearest grocery store was 5 miles away, and that was 5 miles too far for anyone relying on the city bus or their own tired legs. What people called food came mostly in plastic: noodles, chips, frozen dinners. The children grew up never seeing a vine heavy with tomatoes, or a row of corn tasseling in the breeze. Freshness was a luxury, and hope wasn't much cheaper. It wasn't always like this. There had been families, porches filled with laughter, and block parties that lasted well into summer evenings. But over the years, jobs disappeared, homes emptied, and the city stopped sending trash trucks as often as it used to. Streetlights went dark one by one until whole blocks felt forgotten by the rest of the world. People learned to keep to themselves, eyes lowered, doors bolted. It wasn't hatred that kept them apart, it was weariness. Everyone was surviving the best they could. Mara arrived just as winter was loosening its grip. She'd served 2 tours overseas, and though she came home in one piece, the war had left its mark in quieter ways. She moved into a tiny house built through a community outreach program, a simple place with a porch no bigger than a bedsheet and a patch of earth behind it that hadn't seen a spade in years. She didn't know many people, and most of her neighbors didn't say much more than a polite nod, but that was fine. Silence had become her closest friend. She noticed things, though: the way older folks waited for the charity van to drop off boxes of canned food, the way kids lined up at the gas station for bags of chips because there was nowhere else to go. It reminded her of something she'd seen overseas: villages trying to live on whatever scraps could be found, people forced to survive without tools, without choices. She knew what that kind of hunger did to a spirit. One chilly afternoon, Mara found a forgotten packet of seeds tucked in a box of supplies she'd brought with her. The front read "Heirloom Tomatoes" in faded letters. She turned the packet over in her hand, remembering her grandmother's garden, the smell of warm soil, the sound of bees. Without thinking much about it, she went out back with a rusty shovel she'd borrowed from the maintenance shed and started breaking ground. The soil was stubborn. Years of neglect had hardened it like concrete, but she kept at it until a small rectangle of earth lay ready. A few days later, one of her neighbors, a wiry man named Curtis, stopped at the fence. "You trying to grow something in that dirt?" he asked. "Trying," she said, leaning on her shovel. "Doesn't look promising yet." Curtis chuckled. "Ain't nobody grown anything here in 20 years. Ground's probably forgotten how." "Then we'll remind it," Mara said. He raised an eyebrow but smiled, and that was the beginning of something small and unexpected. Weeks passed, and tiny green shoots began to push through the soil. Mara knelt beside them each morning, pulling weeds and pressing the earth gently around their stems. Word spread, as it always does when someone does something out of the ordinary. People walking by started to linger at her fence. A woman from 2 houses down brought her a cracked watering can. A boy asked if he could help plant something. She handed him a handful of bean seeds and showed him how to press them into the soil. It wasn't long before the little patch of land began to look like a garden. Bright rows of beans and peppers stood beside a border of marigolds that Mara had added to keep pests away. And with each day, it seemed as though the colors and the laughter grew side by side. Curtis started planting too, using old buckets and whatever soil he could find. Then Mrs. Green from the corner lot turned over a strip of her yard and planted collard greens and turnips. The kids began trading stories about whose plants were growing fastest. They came to Mara with questions. "How deep do you plant corn? Why do tomato vines need cages? What's compost?" She taught them what she knew, and what she didn't know, she learned with them. By midsummer, the block was changing. What once smelled of dust and asphalt now carried the scent of fresh soil and herbs. A few people put folding chairs out front again. Conversation started up. Someone fixed the old streetlight at the corner. One of the teenagers painted a mural on a brick wall, bright vegetables twined with words that read, "We grow together." For the first time in years, the neighborhood began to feel alive. Mara noticed the difference inside herself too. She started each morning the same way she had back in the service, checking her tools, making a plan, doing the work. The rhythm grounded her. It reminded her of the bonds she'd once known among her platoon. Strangers forced to depend on one another, learning to trust, to share, to protect what mattered. The work in the soil was no different. Everyone here had weathered hardship. Everyone was doing their best to hold the line against despair. And together, they were winning small victories, one seedling at a time. By late August, their little collective garden had turned into something remarkable. Zucchini, corn, beans, strawberries, and peppers grew in neat rows. They started trading their harvests: collards for corn, beans for tomatoes, squash for peppers. Mara noticed that no one went hungry that month. She also noticed something else. People were talking, laughing, sharing recipes passed down through generations. One evening, she stood at her porch and watched two neighbors argue good-naturedly over whose hot sauce recipe was best, and she couldn't help but smile. It was Curtis who came up with the idea for a harvest celebration. "We've been working like farmers," he said. "Might as well eat like 'em too." So they set up card tables in the middle of the street, covering them with mismatched tablecloths. Everyone brought something from their gardens or their kitchens: okra stew, cornbread, roasted corn, jars of homemade pickles. Kids darted between the tables while a battered old radio played soul music from someone's porch. Mara watched as people she'd once seen avoid each other now shared laughter and second helpings. She thought about how far they'd come, not just as neighbors, but as a kind of family. The fear that used to hang in the air had been replaced by the sound of conversation and the smell of good food. Even the police cruiser that rolled slowly past didn't stop. The officer just smiled and waved before driving on. As the evening sky deepened into gold, Curtis raised a paper cup and said, "Next year, we do it bigger." Everyone cheered. Mara found herself blinking back tears. It wasn't sadness, it was something else. Gratitude, maybe. She thought about her platoon overseas, the way they had learned to rely on one another in a place that felt like the edge of the world. That same bond was here now, growing out of this unlikely garden in the middle of a forgotten city. Different battle, same kind of courage. When the last of the daylight faded and the radio quieted, Mara stayed behind to stack the chairs and gather the dishes. Fireflies blinked among the rows of plants. The soil under her feet was warm and alive. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was home. The next morning, she walked to the end of the block where the mural shimmered in the new sunlight. Someone had added another line beneath it during the night, painted in neat white letters, "Roots of Renewal." Mara stood there for a long time, reading the words, smiling softly to herself. She looked down the street, at the flowers, the green vines climbing fences, the faces of people tending to what they'd grown, and she realized that the garden had never really been about vegetables. It was about faith, and the quiet bravery of people who had decided that they weren't going to let their world fall apart any longer. And just like that, a once-forgotten neighborhood had found its rhythm again. If you enjoyed this story and believe in second chances and the power of community, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories of hope and resilience.